Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this live town hall. I'm Liz Murphy, the forum producer at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished historic guests today. Joining us is Second President of the United States, John Adams, First Lady Abigail Adams, Third President, Thomas Jefferson, Fourth President, James Madison, and First Lady, Dolley Madison. We're taking your questions today on email. Please email JFK President's Day, that's all one word, JFK President's Day at nara.gov. And now, our first question from the audience is for all of our distinguished guests today. What experience best prepared you for your time in the White House? President Adams, might we start with you?
Certainly. I would say all of my years in Congress during the war certainly prepared me for debate with gentlemen from other colonies, later states. And I would say even more than that was my travel in Europe, from the various courts and to the various countries, be it France, Holland, and later England as minister to the court of St. James. All of that together, along with a Harvard education, I might add, prepared me to be president of the United States.
I have to agree entirely with my friend President Adams. Previous public service was the best preparation for holding the highest office in our nation. Like Mr. Adams, I had served in public office before, and like Mr. Adams, I was privileged to pursue an education, to pursue a collegiate education, go to college. I was voted to be the second elected governor of the new Commonwealth of Virginia. I was appointed to the Continental Congress before that in Philadelphia, where I met Mr. Adams in the spring of 1775. And after the war, I was commissioned to represent our nation in France as minister plenipotentiary before the court of Louis XVI of France. And Mr. Adams was already there representing our nation. And when I returned, I was appointed the first Secretary of Foreign Affairs. It was that knowledge of serving our nation in foreign governments that prepared me for that. And of course, Mr. Adams had already served as Minister Plenipotentiary of our nation at the court of George III. Like Mr. Adams, I was also Vice President of our nation. So that previous experience in public office was so very, very important for me.
For myself, if I can interject, I'd like to say, similarly, while not holding public office, the experience and the privilege of being able to travel for a period of time before John's vice presidency or presidency, in particular for a girl like myself from a very small town in South Shore, Massachusetts, from Weymouth. I'd not traveled outside of Massachusetts before heading off to join John in Europe. It was quite an adjustment to be able to see those grand houses, large establishments, the activities of nobles. And while, of course, we wouldn't replicate every one of those elements of grandeur when establishing the new nation, it allowed me at least to have a bit of a broader mentality than just my own small town, my own little farm life. So being able to see other ways of life and perhaps adjust upward a little bit and serve as the wife of the president in a respectable manner.
In our war for independence, I served for a brief time upon the governor's privy council. Being in the executive branch of government during war prepared me for the crucible of war that would be my second administration. But I suspect that which prepared me publicly more than anything else was serving for 8 years as my worthy friend President Jefferson's Secretary of State. A great deal of my challenges as president being how to collaborate with nations abroad and how to establish America's true independence amongst the League of Nations. But I suspect the thing that prepared me more than anything else was being Dolley Madison's husband.
Oh, thank you, my dear, for I was just about to say that nothing quite can prepare you for your time in the presidential house and in that seat of power. Well, I am no stranger to doing things as I please, which I'm sure my husband can attest to. And I will say that my time in the presidential mansion has been no different. Of course, I have had some wonderful examples before me of First Ladies, Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Washington, and they have been very good examples of how to facilitate this role, this very new role of First Lady. And I dare say that I did choose to make a few changes for myself, for I know no way other than to do it as I should like to do it. And I think it has worked out just as it should.
Thank you all for your reflections. Our next question is for President Adams. Can you talk about your relationship with your son, John Quincy Adams?
Indeed. Quite a bright light that son of mine is. I can indeed. I had the pleasure of bringing him to France with me on my first voyage on the Boston in February of 1778, and to learn French along with him, though I must say that his learning rate was much faster than mine. And of course, he had the French surgeon to aid him on our travel over. And what an education for a young man to be over in France, to later be in Holland, schooling in both places, and then to go off to Russia with Francis Dana to seek the shall we say, the approval of Empress Catherine. I knew that he was going to be carrying on the Adams tradition of public service, and both Mrs. Adams and I encouraged him when he was not with us in letters, as well as when he was with us, that traveling to Europe was a great advantage for him, for his education, and that he owed a debt to the people of America to contribute to the betterment of our society.
Mrs. Adams, did you have any thoughts you'd like to add before we turn to our next question?
Largely echoing my husband's sentiments, I can say that as a mother who, as a wife who would never have expected her own husband to sit in this seat of the chief executive of the nation, and being rather proud of that, it is immensely more pride to be able to say that I raised such a good, fine man and a good servant to his country, to be as also the mother of another president of the United States. John Quincy's always very, very clever boy. It was hard to let him go in his teenage years to join John in Europe and spend years away from him. But, oh, he took advantage of every moment while he was there, learning as much as he could, and a good, dutiful son, and as I mentioned, a fantastic servant to the nation. I could not be more proud.
Thank you, President and Mrs. Adams.
Indeed.
President Jefferson, our next question is for you. Could you speak to your role in writing the Declaration of Independence?
Well, thank you for giving me the honor to represent, as President Washington referred to it, the promise of our nation. But I was not the first who was invited to take up the pen to write it. Remember, I was one of 5 men appointed to a committee by the president of our Continental Congress, John Hancock. And when we all met at Benjamin Franklin's house, because Benjamin Franklin was one of that committee, Mr. Adams, you yourself served, Mr. Sherman from Connecticut, Mr. Livingston from New York. Well, you remember, Mr. Adams, it was Dr. Franklin whom we thought should write the Declaration. But he replied that as he was growing older, he cared not to write anything further that would receive the scrutiny of a committee. Well, Mr. Adams, I believe it was you who suggested that I should write it. And then I turned about and said, no, you should write it. I should not make statement of what you said. Let that be your opportunity. But I do remember well, the responsibility was then put on me. And so I took up the pen. It took me 3 days to write our declaration on 4 sheets of paper. Very simply, I make mistakes. It is not easy to erase ink. And so I had to write corrections above, beneath my mistakes. And then that evening, I would, simply transcribe all of it clearly again. And the next day, I'd make more mistakes. So finally, I finished the first draft. I gave it then to the other four men on the committee, and the work was out of my hands. They made their opinions and corrections known in that second draft. And then, of course, the committee gave it to the Congress for their final additions, deletions, approvals, and then finally to be voted upon them after we voted for independence. Mr. Adams, you well remember that the 2nd of July, as you always remind us, is the true birthday of our nation. That was the 2nd. The 4th, 2 days later, was when we voted on our declaration.
Yes, I believe the quote you were searching for from me is that, well, as I remember now in old age, I think that perhaps that I said something along the lines of that I was considered obnoxious by some and that you were far the better writer. But perhaps as a younger man, I might have just said that there should be a Virginian at the head of this business. But make no mistake about it, once it was completed, I felt it my duty to take the floor of our Congress and defend not only the thought of independence, but your beautiful document as well. And it was a privilege to do it, though I suspect no one would want me to do it today for 2 hours as I did then.
Thank you both very much. President Madison, one of our viewers asks you, do you think the War of 1812 with Great Britain could have been avoided?
Fascinating question. Would you know, I have sat somewhat curious as to this format by which we correspond. I might speak to my wife, who is in the next room. However, speak to my worthy friend, Mr. Jefferson, transcending the difference between the federal city and his native Albemarle County, while simultaneously speaking with the Adamses in Massachusetts. Must give leave to wonder if I had access to such a wonder in my time of office, if that War of 1812 could have been subverted. Make no mistake, through American policy, we tried for the better part of some 20 years, and it could be argued further, to find any peaceful solution we could betwixt England and France. Previous administrations found some difficulty with French policies and put forward some of their own policies that were source of great controversy to the American character. But towards the end of my worthy friend President Jefferson's administration, he put forward an economic coercion in the form of the embargo, which, it could be said, did more damage domestic than it ever did abroad. Now, in my second term of office, I put forward a bill proffered by one Mr. Macon, 2 bills, endeavoring to secure from both England and France certain conditions by which peace could be pursued. From that, we received a response from France saying they would adhere to this agreement, but did not receive word from England that they would. It was this that inevitably in June of 1812 compelled me to go to Congress to ask for a declaration of war, not knowing that making its way across the Atlantic was the agreement from England that they would cede to that bill. Now, had we had access to this format, it could be argued that our differences could have been accommodated peacefully. However, that is supposition. The true end and cause of the War of 1812 was the honor of America's Navy abroad, the impressment of American sailors, ensuring that our liberties could not be secured outside the bounds of our territory. And in that end, I do fear that a contest of arms betwixt ourselves and our mother country, so long as they remained upon American shores and our frontier and disrespected our sailors abroad, would be an inevitability.
Thank you very much, President Madison. Our next question is for First Ladies Dolley Madison and Abigail Adams from Arley in Massachusetts. You are both very bright women. What was it like to be a woman during these early years when women were very invisible in society and thought of as homemakers and primary caretakers for children?
Thank you for the question. I will say, I have grown in a world where women indeed are not invisible. I also fear that I have been told that I dress quite ostentatiously. I grew as a young woman in the Quaker faith, and of course the clothing of that faith is quite simple and grays and to detract attention from oneself. And upon my marrying my dear husband there, Jimmy, I shed the clothes of the Quaker faith, shed the Quaker faith indeed, and proceeded to find that I preferred yellows and reds. And so in just visual presence alone, I am quite the opposite of invisible. I am not wearing my feathers upon my head today, but in most occasions, I top my already tall frame with some more height, so you could see me going wherever you need in a crowd. And indeed, the Quaker faith, though visually quiet, women are invited into the circle of friends. It is the case that everyone in the congregation leads the congregation. So it is not just a man's position to be a leader in the faith, but rather everyone's responsibility, including women. And so I was taught at an early age that my voice did matter. And not only did it matter, it was heard and respected. And I grew up with many a lady who made her opinion known. And though there are many expectations placed upon women, there's no doubt about that. I find that there are many ways to break those expectations if you find them.
It was very, very well spoken, Mrs. Madison. I should like to say that, as I may have mentioned before, my dear husband places a good amount of faith and weight in my own words and opinions, which may not be the circumstance for many marriages and partnerships in our contemporary life. I will say that one of my primary goals is universal education. Of course, the mind of a woman is ultimately just as fertile, just as sharp, just as keen, and able to comprehend large, difficult concepts, to be able to form opinions and make strong, solid, wise decisions. But if you deprive women of education, they'll never be able to gain the language with which they can speak those opinions, with which they can make those wise choices. It has been a good movement in these early years of our nation, that there is more of an emphasis on women's education. Quite a long way to go on it still, but if we are to have philosophers and statesmen, we must have learned women. And in societies and cultures that respect a universal education and respect the opinions of women who have been able to cultivate those, it is a much more fruitful culture, fruitful society, and a much more democratic one as well.
Many thanks to you both. Our next question is for all of our guests. Our audience is curious about each of your perspectives on this question. You all helped make a country that was founded on freedom. Why didn't the Constitution outlaw slavery?
Well, that would probably be a question, not that I will not answer, but myself and Mr. Jefferson, of course, were abroad, and Mr. Madison was the one who was in Philadelphia for the convention. But it is troublesome. And of course, we all knew that it was an institution, that institution of slavery, that we would face time and time again in Congress, because it, at some point, was going to need resolution, and it would not be in our time. Let me put it this way. During the time of the War of Independence, we had need of all of our colonies that became states, an alliance of all the colonies and later states together, and any attempt to abridge the right of property in the South, they would have left the war effort altogether, and it would have left New England alone. In the Constitutional Convention, I did defend the Constitution, and I believe that at some point there will be resolution to the matter of slavery. There was a time limit that was placed on the slave trade, but not slavery itself. It is a very difficult question to answer. Mrs. Adams and I are very much against slavery and very much about the words of these great documents stating what is truly right. It will come with time, but it will be a very painful time, I am afraid.
I'll say John and I are largely of the same opinion, though we cannot divest ourselves of benefiting from a society in which slavery is an aspect. Now, of course, we owned no people in our own life as adults and raising our family, but I was raised in a household that did have enslaved people in it. Upon my father's death, when he freed his remaining slaves, I did my very best to welcome them as free people, a part of our community. In fact, asking one of his former enslaved servants, Phoebe, to be the caretaker of our household while we went to Europe, to give her and her new husband a bit of a home of their own. And as the years went by, other freed and formerly enslaved freed people, again, encouraging education and giving them the means to establish themselves as individuals in a free state. Personally, I think that slavery is a dreadful sin, and perhaps there are elements of the struggles of the United States which may be a punishment from the Almighty for such a great sin. But I will also acknowledge that as a woman from New England who was not raised in the same structures as those of the South, it may be easier for me to say this than perhaps some of our other dear friends in this meeting.
As to my own personal participation upon the institution, I am pleased to answer that question at hand, but as to the direct question, particularly as it pertains to the Constitution, should you look within the confines of the 7 articles of the document, you will find no mention of the word slave or enslave. This is the masterpiece of circumlocution that exists within it. It simultaneously exonerates itself from the institution, but is complicit in the perpetrating and perpetuating of it. This is because of the debate and contention that existed in that summer of 1787. A gentleman from the North endeavored to put forward clauses within that document that ended the traffic of slavery there in that moment. We sat within Philadelphia City, a city which some years prior had introduced a gradual manumission law. But pervading throughout the entirety of it was the Southern interest. The Southern interest that wished to guarantee the right to hold property in men in perpetuity. Now, upon that, we've seen the mere distinction of color as justification for the most oppressive dominion of man over man. This Constitution, in its estimation and hope, is to endure forever. It is our hope that it might endure beyond the institution of slavery itself. Yet here is the pervading question that exists throughout. We might end the institution of slavery, but if we do not do something to simultaneously address the racial prejudice that justifies it, how soon before new institutions are erected that simultaneously rob a faction of mankind who by a distinct peculiarity are separate from becoming subordinate, while another faction becomes supreme? Now, upon that, I will say I am as equally complicit as a great many of the framers of the document. Before I could consent to own them, I've had people prescribed to my name before they could consent to be owned. They have been labeled property. My wife and I hold some 130 people in bondage every day. There is a young manservant who ensures I am dressed, ensures I am shaved. It is the only way of life that I have known, but does that make it right? No, most assuredly not. Now, upon that, it is my hope that our Constitution, capable of change, might, if a people, by their zeal and adherence to liberty, call for it, see the end to that institution. But I am not as optimistic as Mr. Adams. We see every day great debate spread as to how this institution of slavery can survive, can spread to Western territories, and every day I spoke it at the Constitutional Convention. We see greater division betwixt North and South upon the issue of slavery that threatens disunion. Now, it is my fear that that which might be lost in the pursuit to the end of the institution is this union of the states.
I will add not much more to that. My husband has answered so beautifully this position that we find ourselves in. And I spoke a bit about the Quaker faith in which I was raised. And when I was 15, as the Quaker faith has dictated at that time, slavery is to not be tolerated within the circle of friends. And my father then manumitted all 8 of our enslaved people and moved my family to Philadelphia. And therefore I had an example of what life could be like without relying upon the labor of others. And yet I find myself, as my husband has stated, at the convenience of this institution we are still within, indeed.
I thank everyone who has proffered their opinions in support of what they have already written and what we have always talked about for many, many years. I, of course, am the one invited, as we noted earlier, to take up the pen and to write our declaration, to write at the very beginning what we hold to be self-evident. And that indeed is that all men are born equal, created equal. That means mankind, the family of man. It's a resuscitation, if you will, a reiteration of the Justinian Code of Law, the first civil body of law, accepted by Western man in the 6th century by Roman Emperor Justinian I. Essentially, everyone is born free. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person. That had nearly been forgotten through the ages of the darkest ignorance, had it not been for many a monk, many a scribe, in their dark cells by the flicker of a candlelight, to transcribe that wisdom of the modern world, that it would be available for us in this modern world. The wisdom of the ancient world, that it may be available in this modern world. The precious invention of the printing press, to pronounce this, disseminate it universally. And John Locke, to write, amongst our inalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of. I was the one who wrote the pursuit of happiness. Mr. Locke wrote the pursuit of property. The right, indeed, to property, it's 9/10 of our law, the inheritance of the British law, our Constitution, possession, and yet, as Justinian I meant, and Mr. Locke understood, and I pursued to clarify and make it more universal, the first element of property is yourself, the individual. You have a right to yourself, and you cannot deny that to another. Therein rests the pursuit of happiness. Therein rests, if you will, an individual to fulfill their capacity. I could sit here and make excuses for all that I have pursued from my early life to bring about an ending of the importation of the enslaved to Virginia. I can speak about being present at the Congress in Annapolis, the spring of 1784, in which, as chairman of the report on the Northwest Territories, I wrote that by the year 1800, we shall end the involuntary servitude of man into the Northwest and end it entirely in territories to come in as states. It lost by 1 vote. And I was not here as it became part of the Northwest Ordinance of 1785, and then the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, in which we somewhat drew a line politically that can only be crossed upon this subject. Almost 3630 to admit any territories north of that to enter our union as free, and then the territories south of it to enter enslaved. It is that so-called compromise in which we admitted Maine, our 23rd state, and then the territory of Missouri entered our 24th state, where the compromise was a corruption of the compromises that we made in founding our nation. It compromised our founding principles. for Missouri to enter enslaved and Maine free. As I wrote, this is a fire bell in the night. All I fear, do not see that speck on our horizon, which may someday fall upon us as a great tornado. Indeed, it could mean the knell of our union. I remain hopeful that we can continue to work together in the preservation of this union. And yes, I continue to make excuses. Now that we've made the compromise, I will admit perhaps then the institution of the enslaved will just more or less dilute itself farther to the west, but that will take time. And I will not be here. None of us will. Yes, I am hopeful that this will end. I'm encouraged that it will. And I rest upon the theology already referred to. Thank you, Mrs. Adams. Thank you, Mrs. Madison. Because we know our God is a just God. He cannot but abhor the institution of slavery. And we should well remind ourselves, his justice will not sleep forever. Nothing is more assuredly written in the book of faith than these people ought to be free.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful reflections, and how sorry I am that our time in this town hall draws short. Might we ask one more very brief question to all of you? Our last question of the day, and again, very brief responses. Did you have animal friends or pets in the White House when you were young?
Well, I shall defer to Mrs. Adams on that, because when I think of animals, I think of all the animals that we had upon our farm and still have on our farm, from Braintree to Quincy.
Aside from the working animals on the farm, I do have a certain fondness for pets along the way. Around the time of John's presidency, I myself had a wonderful Newfoundland named Juno, one of the dear joys of my life. And if you love me, you must love my dog.
I can relate, as I have a parrot that I have named Polly, and she is one of the most treasured parts of my life. Sorry, Mr. Madison, not the most treasured.
Not in the least. My beautiful wife has her parrot, and I have the scars.
My favorite pets, of course, remain the horse. I'm never a day out of the saddle. I enjoyed not a day in the office of the president without being in the saddle. I thank Mr. Madison for reminding everyone of the merino sheep. They were a gift by General the Marquis de Lafayette. And yet I will tell you, I think my favorite household animal remains the cat and the mockingbird. Mockingbirds are profuse throughout all of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm delighted to teach them how to speak. And so, yes, while president, I had my favorite mockingbird there. His name was Richard. And I brought him to many a cabinet meeting to speak his mind as he should choose.
Thank you all so much. And thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us today. We appreciate our distinguished historic guests' informative answers to all of the questions posed by you, our viewers. Now, please stick around and don't miss the opportunity to go behind the scenes of our museum and archives with a mini exhibit tour and a look at a few letters to President Kennedy from our collection starting at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And do remember that you can rewatch your favorites or catch anything you missed from today through our website. Thank you all again.